Welcome to the next lecture in our lecture series Neural Data Science. Last week we talked about receptive field models and how to estimate the filters of receptive fields from data in an efficient way. While today we talk about more complex systems identification tasks in more complex models, for example, using deep neural networks. We started last week with a model similar to this one, with a linear, nonlinear Poisson model, where the stimulus was filtered with a linear receptive field, which was passed through a nonlinearity, and with added noise we generated a response, for example, using a Poisson assumption on the noise. We already saw in the last lecture that for some neurons that perform nonlinear computations, for example, for the complex cell, such a model may not be sufficient. Therefore, we can extend this concept to so-called linear-nonlinear, linear-nonlinear subunit models. In this case, the stimulus is passed by an array of receptive field filters, which all have their own nonlinearity before the output of these nonlinearities is summed together and passed again through an output nonlinearity. With this class of models, we have a richer possibilities to model stimulus-response relationships. Optionally, we can also add something like a response history filter. So subunit models such as these are somewhat in complexity between very simple LNP style models that oversimplify most of the computations that happen in real neural systems, and very complex models of the retinal circuitry, in this case for retina data, or also cortical circuitry for cortical data, that in all its details is probably also hard to infer from data. This kind of subunit models are situated at a moderate level of complexity somewhere between these two extremes. In the last lecture, I already introduced the concept of using a spline basis for inferring receptive fields, and because such subunit models have even more parameters, because one parameter set has to be learned for each of these subunits, using the spline basis is even more helpful in this case. So here we have an LNP model for a certain ganglion cell that is learned from data, and here we have the subunit model. And you can see that with the amount of data we have available, these subunits are quite noisy and come out very faintly. If we use the spline basis, we can both get a better fit with an LNP model, but also get very nice and localized receptive fields for the individual subunits. Such subunits can improve model performance in some systems. So here, if we have a recording, we have both an LNP and an LN-LN model with subunits, and the predictions are both shown here. Then we can plot the correlation coefficient as a measure of prediction quality between the predicted response trace, the predicted response rate, either by the LNP or by the subunit model, and compare that to the true data. And then we find that in this case here, the subunit model always improves the predictions. In some cases, it actually has been shown that subunits in such a model can correspond to elements of the actual circuitry. So in the retina, ganglion cells get input from bipolar cells, which are presynaptic to them. And there's some evidence, at least in some recordings, that the subunits obtained by such subunit models, that they actually correspond to individual bipolar cells. So in this case, for example, we have a single LN model of the ganglion cells, and if we measure its width, it has a distribution with an average between 150 and 200 micrometers. And if we fit a subunit model instead, we get such 4 subunits, and the size of these subunits is on the scale of what we would expect from the presynaptic partners of the ganglion cells, the bipolar cells. So it is possible, and there's also more direct evidence that shows that these subunits in fact correspond to bipolar cells. So subunit models can also be used to close the gap between statistical and circuit-based models. We can even build models with more circuit structure inbuilt. So there's a whole cascade of models where we have here a stimulus, individual subunits that are filtered and then pre-processed. There's delay terms that feeds back in, so spike history terms or delay terms on various levels. And if we build a hierarchy of such models, then we can get closer and closer to predicting the spike trains, in this case of ganglion cells in the retina. So the most complex model here is a linear, nonlinear feedback delay, some nonlinear feedback model. And this actually on average predicts neural activity of ganglion cells the best. The advantage is that we can look inside all of these terms in these models and try to interpret them in terms of their structure. So here we can see that, for example, the delay term, this really is responsible for shifting the surround a bit backwards. So while these subunit models are typically inspired by getting closer to the retinal circuitry, one could also take another approach and say, well, we basically make the subunits continuous and use deep neural networks to predict neural activity. In deep neural networks, especially in convolutional networks, we have this kind of subunit mechanism already built in. So the idea behind a convolutional neural network is that you have a filter that you move across the entire image. So that could, for example, correspond to an individual bipolar cell type whose receptive field is applied across the entire image before it is then combined back before a certain ganglion cell type samples from these representations by the bipolar cells. So if one wants, one can see these kind of deep neural network representations or these convolutional neural network representations here as an alternate attempt to be inspired by the circuits of the retina to predict the responses. And in fact, deep neural networks do quite well at that. So here one can see that they really close the gap to the overall reliability or the fraction of variance that can be explained in the data. We can also go back and look at the units and the filters and actually find that they look a bit like receptive fields of presynaptic elements of ganglion cells. So trained on white noise, they have receptive fields, these kernels here in one of the earlier layers, that are reminiscent of the receptive field of bipolar cells. Interestingly, the structure of these receptive fields also differ between different stimuli. So whether you use white noise or natural scenes, then they are larger and more smoothed out and have stronger surrounds. The good thing about using deep neural networks to predict neural activity is there's a whole bunch of different open source tools from the entire deep learning industry kind of at your fingertips, and you can use those for your systems identification with neurons. So implementing a model as on the last slide is actually super simple. The parameter inference in deep neural networks, the key ingredient for that is so-called backpropagation. So where we have the forward pass, we put a sample through a neural network with parameters b and w. We compute a linear representation and then the nonlinear one. And we pass that through the different layers until we can evaluate the loss function for that particular stimulus. Backpropagation is then the process of efficiently passing the loss signal, the derivative signal, back through this graph. So we compute, for example, here the derivative of the loss with respect to that function and the derivative of that function with respect to the parameters in that layer. If you want, again, the details, I refer you back to our Machine Learning 1 course in the winter term that is linked above. with this toolbox of deep learning, we can even implement more complex models. While the models that I talked about up to now were fit also for individual neurons, we can, or had features that were trained for individual neurons, we can now also use feature sharing across neurons. So we can use a feature space that is learned from the data, but models the responses of individual neurons. For example, this can be useful for recovering cell types. So in this simulation here, we had two types, small ones and large ones, and the learned kernels in our feature sharing space really corresponded quite well to these types. So if we use the activation of these two filters in a two-dimensional scatter plot, you can see one class of neurons down here and the other class of neurons up here. One can add more bells and whistles to such models. So for example, one can have such a feature extractor. One can also add a temporal dynamic. And then, for example, if one records the eye movements of a neuron or activities such as running or modulation of the pupil size, we can additionally add that into our model with modulator and shifter networks that automatically correct for those and take them into account. One can also use not only de novo trained networks, but also pre-trained networks. What do we mean by that? So there are large architectures of neural networks, as for example the AlexNet or the VGG16 architecture that are available online, and they were trained to do object classification on a huge set of images. One can now use these networks with the parameters as they are to also predict neural activity. So basically, in this case, one states the hope that the representation learned by the network is somehow more generally useful beyond pure object classification. So for example, one can use that for V1 systems identification as done in this paper from colleagues in Tübingen. So here they showed to monkeys in the visual cortex, they showed a series of briefly flashed images and then tried to model the relationship between these images and the elicited neural activity. So the experiment looks like this. So this gray dot is the fixation spot of the monkey, so it shows you where the animal is looking. Then you can see it's looking around. When it's looking in the middle, then over the receptive field of the neurons, a number of different images are very briefly flashed. The recordings were done with such a laminar probe, and you already know from the previous lectures how to interpret such plots. So you can see for the individual spike sorted units, you can see the footprints on the probe. You can also see PSTH raster plots, how they modulate the activity upon the change of an image, and here linear STAs of these neurons. The authors then used a VGG-based model where they simply used the parameters of a pre-trained VGG to compute a representation in a certain feature map and then train linear readouts to model the activity of the neurons. So this part was kept fixed. So in this case, they didn't learn an entire feature space, but they used the feature space from object recognition or object classification to predict neural activity. And just this readout was learned. In this case, one can of course try to select the optimal layer for prediction. And here it was somewhere in the middle. So it was that kind of makes sense because the data that was modeled came from early visual cortex. And one could expect, for example, that if one went to more higher object recognition cortices, such as IT, then maybe this best layer would be somewhere up here. One can also add lots of regularizers to such a model. So one can add, for example, a smoothness constraint, sparsity, and so on, and then also study what happens if one leaves out those constraints or these regularizers. And these can have dramatic effects. And if you don't regularize at all, then also your structure doesn't look good. Now, if we look at how well such a transfer learning network does, it actually does really well and even better than a convolutional network for that particular data trained de novo on the data, because it's more data efficient, because it has a lot of inductive bias from the object classification task. So you can see here, the best model is the VGG. Now, in general, over the past years, it has been shown that these that such deep neural networks, they are not particularly close to the underlying circuitry or the biophysical mechanisms that that are used by neural tissue to compute information, but they provide really good predictive models. And one concept that can demonstrate how good these predictive models are is that of most exciting images. So here, a set of natural images is shown to an animal, to a brain, where a lot of responses are recorded. And then an artificial neural network is trained to model these responses. It can predict the responses really well. And so one can use the model to find an image that should optimally excite. So most exciting image that should most strongly excite a certain model neuron. And then on the next day, the authors of that study went back and showed that particular most exciting image to the neuron to check whether really the prediction is true that this MEI excites the neurons more strongly than other images. These MEIs are in fact different from simple receptive fields. So in some cases, they are reasonably similar, but in other cases, they can also be quite different. And if we look at the response of neurons to the MEI or to control stimuli, for example, the linear receptive field, then typically the response to the MEI is much higher. So through the nonlinear deep neural network, it was possible to find images that are actually better at exciting a neuron than the linear receptive field. So today, deep neural networks are versatile tools in systems identification of neural systems, and I showed you some applications here on how to use them. Thanks for your attention.